A giant cowboy bought a girl from child labor. That's what the whole camp saw. One minute she was scrubbing pots till her hands bled. The next, she was riding away wrapped in his saddle blanket. Folks thought he'd just taken pity. But out here, pity can get a man killed. The dust hadn't even settled when a black-coated stranger rode in, saying the girl saw something she wasn't meant to see, a truth worth more than gold. And worth killing for? Now the biggest man. The territory rides with the child who trusts no one, chased by men who don't miss when they aim. Church bells fade into the wind. Hoofbeats echo in the canyons, and somewhere out there, fire and rope wait for them both. He swore to protect her, but when the West decides you're guilty, will even a giant's shadow be enough to keep death? From their door, every story I share leads with love, for people, for healing, for the things we sometimes forget to say out loud that the bitter wind whistled through. Dead Man's Cut as Caleb Ransom guided his horse between the towering walls of red rock. His breath came out in white puffs, mixing with the steam from the idle locomotive that dominated the railway camp. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the frozen ground. Doing little to warm the February air, Caleb's mare picked her, way carefully around scattered railroad ties and piles of iron spikes. The camp buzzed with activity, workers shouting orders, hammers striking metal, and the persistent hiss of steam engines. His weathered face remained impassive, but his jaw tightened at the thought of confronting the camp boss about his overdue wages. 6 months of driving cattle through tough country, and still no pay to show for it. The big cowboy sat straight in his saddle, his broad shoulders squared against the cold. At 6 feet 5 inches tall, he towered over most men even when dismounted. His presence drew curious glances from the railroad workers, but he paid them no mind. He'd learned long ago that his size often intimidated folks, so he developed a habit of moving with deliberate, calm doubt. As he approached the mess tent, a sound caught his attention, the clatter of a heavy pot being dragged across wooden planks. Caleb turned to see a slight figure struggling with a cast iron cooking vessel, nearly half her size. The girl couldn't have been more than 15, her thin frame drowning in a threadbare dress despite the bitter cold. Her hands, red and blistered, trembled as she tried to lift the pot. Mas rapido. The camp cook bellowed from inside the tent. Faster, girl. Those beans won't serve themselves. The girl flinched at his harsh tone, but said nothing. She took another limping step, her face pinched with pain and exhaustion. Something in Caleb's chest tightened at the sight. A gruff-looking mule skinner passing by caught Caleb's expression. That's the Alvarez girl, he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. Rosita. Her pa died owing the camp boss money. Now she's working it off, or so they say. He shrugged and moved on, clearly unbothered by the situation. Caleb's hands tightened on his reins. He'd seen enough injustice in his years on the frontier to recognize it plain as day. Without a word, he dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby post. His boot heels crunched in the frozen mud as he made his way to the paymaster's shack. The camp boss, a red-faced man named Morton, barely looked up from his ledger when Caleb ducked through the low doorway. The small space reeked of cheap whiskey and stale tobacco. Come for your wages, Ransom. Morton's pen scratched across the paper. Ain't got 'em yet. Check back next month. Been hearing that same tune for half a year now. Caleb's voice was quiet but firm. But right now I'm here about something else. The Alvarez girl. Morton's pen stopped moving. He looked up with narrowed eyes. What about her? How much does she owe? A slow, ugly smile spread across Morton's face. More than a week's wages, that's for certain. Her pa ran up quite a tab before that accident. He leaned back in his chair. Why? You looking to buy her contract? Caleb's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew hard as granite. Without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet. One by one, he laid $18 on the scarred wooden desk, every cent he had to his name. Morton stared at the money, then threw back his head and laughed. You're serious? Giving up 6 months' wages for some Mexican brat? He shook his head, still chuckling as he swept the bills into his desk drawer. She's all yours, big man. Hope she's worth it. Caleb turned without another word and walked out into the yard. The morning had grown colder, or maybe it was just the chill of Morton's words that made him pull his coat tighter. He found Rosita still struggling with the heavy pot near the mess tent. Work around the camp had slowed as men stopped to watch. Caleb approached the girl slowly, careful not to startle her. When she saw his shadow fall across the ground, she looked up with wide, fearful eyes. "It's all right," he said softly, the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "You don't have to stay here anymore. You're free to go." Rosita stared at him, uncomprehending. Her dark eyes darted between his face and the pot she still clutched. "No mas trabio aquí," he said in halting Spanish, one of the few phrases he'd picked up on cattle drives. "You're coming with me." Understanding slowly dawned on her face, followed quickly by disbelief and then a flash of hope, so bright it made Caleb's chest ache. She released her grip on the pot, her raw hands trembling. The camp cook burst out of the tent, red-faced and shouting, but fell silent when Caleb turned to face him. The big cowboy said nothing, just stood there with one hand resting easy on his gun belt. After a moment, the cook backed away. Caleb removed his heavy wool coat and draped it around Rosita's thin shoulders. It swallowed her completely, the hem nearly touching the ground, but some of the tension left her face as warmth seeped into her bones. "Come on," he said gently, guiding her toward his horse. The entire camp watched in silence as he helped her mount, then swung up behind her. Without a backward glance, they rode out of Dead Man's Cut, leaving behind the steam and noise and bitter cold of the railroad camp. Caleb led Rosita through the churned mud of the camp's main thoroughfare, his long stride measured to match her. Shorter steps. Workers paused in their tasks, watching the unlikely pair make their way past the supply wagons and stacks of railroad ties. His bay gelding stomped restfully at the hitch rail, steam rising from its flanks in the cold morning. "Air. Here now," Caleb said softly, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out a thick wool blanket, the edges frayed but still warm. As he turned to offer it to her, a nearby foreman bellowed at a work crew. Rosita flinched hard, her thin shoulders hunching beneath his oversized coat. The reaction made something in Caleb's chest tighten. He'd seen that same fear in young colts that had been handled rough. "It's all right," he murmured, draping the blanket around her shoulders. "Ain't nobody going to hurt you now." The camp's only cafe sat at the edge of the rail yard, a weathered wooden structure with a crooked hot coffee sign hanging from rusty chains. Inside, the air was thick with wood smoke and the smell of burnt coffee. A few railroad men hunched over their cups, paying them little mind as Caleb guided Rosita to a corner table. The cafe owner's wife brought them 2 tin mugs of steaming coffee. Rosita wrapped her raw hands around the warm metal, but didn't drink. Her dark eyes remained fixed on the tabletop. "There's a mission school down in San Miguel," Caleb said after a while, keeping his voice gentle. "Good folks there. They'll see you're looked after proper." Rosita's shoulders seemed to sink further into his coat. "The mission—" It closed. She whispered, her English halting but clear enough. "Last winter, Father Manuel, he got sick. No one came after." Caleb took a long drink of his coffee, considering this new information. "You got any family? Anyone who might take you in?" She shook her head slowly. "Mama died 2 years past. Papa ... Her voice caught. The accident. No more family. Outside the cafe's grimy window, loaded wagons rattled past on their way to the railhead. The noise seemed to make Rosita draw. Further into herself, she glanced up at him through dark lashes, then quickly backed down at her untouched coffee. "I can cook," she said, so quietly he had to lean forward to hear. "And so, I learned quick." Her fingers worried at a loose thread on the blanket. If you let me stay, I work hard. No trouble." Caleb sat back, troubled by the plea in her voice. His line shack was 3 days' ride into the high country, no place for a young girl. The winters were harsh, the work endless, and the solitude complete. He'd chosen that life deliberately after Sarah died, finding peace in the isolation. But looking at Rosita's hopeful, fearful face, he knew he couldn't just leave her to whatever fate awaited her here. I'll think on it, he said finally. For now, we need to find you proper lodging for the night. It'll be dark soon. Relief flickered across her features, not a full smile, but close. She nodded quickly, as if afraid he'd change his mind. They finished their coffee as the weak winter sun began to sink behind the canyon walls. Caleb helped Rosita mount his gelding, noting how her hands shook with exhaustion as she gripped the saddle horn. He swung up behind her, and they set off, toward the town of Miller's Crossing, 2 miles distant. The steady sway of the horse's gait soon had Rosita nodding, her head bobbing lower with each step. Caleb kept one arm loosely around her waist to keep her steady. By the time they reached the town's outskirts, she was leaning heavily against his chest. Dead asleep, they spent the night at the widow Parker's boarding house, Rosita in a small room next to the kitchen, while Caleb took a place in the barn. He lay awake long into the night, wrestling with his decision. By morning, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't leave her here alone. The sun was just cresting the eastern hills when they prepared to leave for his winter camp. Caleb had used some of his meager remaining funds to buy Rosita proper winter clothes, sturdy boots, thick wool stockings, and a coat that actually fit her small frame. They were leading the horse down the town's main street when a rider in a black coat pulled up sharply in front of them. Caleb's hand instinctively moved toward his gun as he stepped. Slightly in front of Rosita, the rider reined his horse to a halt, blocking their path. The morning sun glinted off his polished boots and the silver watch chain across his vest. His black coat was too fine for trail wear, marking him as a city man. "Miss Alvarez," he said, tipping his hat with calculated courtesy. "And you must be the gentleman who acquired her contract yesterday." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Andrew Stiles. I represent the railroad's interests in this territory." He shifted in his saddle, looking down at them both. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about the young lady's status." Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself more firmly between Stiles and Rosita. "No misunderstanding. I paid fair and square. Got witnesses." "Oh, the payment isn't in question." Stiles waved a gloved hand dismissively. "It's a matter of ... testimony. You see, Miss Alvarez was present during that unfortunate bridge collapse last month. 5 good workers lost their lives that day." Behind Caleb, Rosita's breath caught. He heard her take a step backward. "Tragic. Accident," Stiles continued, his voice smooth as creek ice. "But accidents can be misinterpreted, especially by young minds under stress. It would be a shame if wild stories started circulating. Stories that might upset Miss Alvarez's new circumstances." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's under my protection now," he said quietly. "Any man who means her harm will answer to me." Stiles studied him for a long moment, then smiled again, that same cold smile that never touched his eyes. "Protection is a noble thing, Mr. Ransom, but the railroad's reach is long, even into these hills you're heading for." He gathered his reins. "Good day to you both." They watched him ride toward town, his black coat stark against the gray morning sky. Only when he disappeared around a bend did Caleb feel Rosita's small hand touch his arm. She was trembling. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get what we need and clear out." The general store's bell jangled as they entered, while the shopkeeper measured out beans, coffee, and flour. Caleb noticed Rosita lingering by a shelf of books. Her fingers traced the spine of a small Bible, then withdrew quickly when she saw him watching. "Add that Bible, too," Caleb told the shopkeeper. When he handed it to Rosita, her eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. They left town under heavy clouds, the mountains ahead shrouded in mist. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, their horses' hooves silent on the needle-covered ground. Rosita held the Bible close as she rode, occasionally opening it to study the pages. With intense concentration, after several miles of silence, she spoke so softly Caleb almost missed it. Senator Caleb, does God listen to people like me? He turned in his saddle to look at her. What do you mean, people like you? She wouldn't meet his eyes. Poor people, Mexican people, people who cannot read his words yet. Caleb was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. God listens to all his children, Rosita. Don't matter if they're rich or poor, where they come from, or what language they speak. He hears every prayer, even even when bad things happen. When people die, and no one cares. The pain in her voice made his chest ache. Especially then, he said softly. That's when he listens hardest. They made camp that evening beneath a rocky overhang, the setting sun painting the clouds crimson. Caleb built a small fire while Rosita arranged their bedrolls and helped prepare a simple supper of beans and flatbread. She sat close to the flames afterward, the Bible open in her lap, mouthing words silently to herself. The warmth and the long day's ride soon had her nodding. When she finally slept, the Bible was clutched against her chest like a shield. Caleb draped his extra blanket over her, then settled with his back against a boulder. Rifle across his knees, the wind shifted, carrying the lonesome whistle of a train from somewhere down in the valley. Caleb's hand tightened on his rifle as he remembered Stiles's cold smile and veiled threats. The railroad man's words echoed in his mind. The railroad's reach is long. He watched Rosita's peaceful face in the dying firelight, knowing that whatever she'd witnessed at that bridge had powerful men worried. Men who wouldn't let a young girl's testimony threaten their interests. Men who thought money could buy silence or worse. The train whistle faded into the distance. Caleb fed another stick to the fire and settled in for a long night's watch. Whatever came, he'd meant what he'd said. She was under his protection now, and he aimed to keep that promise. 2 days of hard riding brought them deeper into the hills. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through bare branches as Caleb guided his horse around the final bend. There, nestled against a rocky slope, stood his line track. The rough-hewn logs wore a dusting of snow, and thin smoke curled from the stone chimney where he'd left banked coals before heading to town. Rosita sat straighter in her saddle, taking in the simple homestead. The cabin perched above a frozen creek, its single window reflecting the waning light. A weathered corral stood empty to one side, while stacked firewood lined the back wall. It ain't much, Caleb said, dismounting to help her down. But it's warm and dry. Her boots crunched in the snow as she looked around, hugging herself against the chill. It is beautiful, she whispered, watching an eagle soar over the valley below. Caleb showed her around, pointing out the essentials. Firewood stacked in that shed, yonder. Outhouse is down that path, behind them pines. Creek's frozen now, but we can chop through for water. He paused. Ain't exactly what you're used to, I reckon. Rosita shook her head. The railroad camp was ... double quotes. She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. I will work hard. You will see. Inside, the cabin was spare, but tidy. A iron cook stove sat against one wall, while a narrow bed occupied the corner furthest from the door. Shelves held basic provisions. Coffee, flour, salt. A Bible-worn but well-cared-for lay on a small table. You can take the bed, Caleb said, setting down their supplies. I'll make do by the fire. Before he could protest, Rosita was already at the hearth, clearing out cold ashes and laying fresh kindling. Her small hands worked quickly, efficiently. Soon a cheerful blaze crackled, pushing back the gathering shadows. The next week settled into a rhythm. Each morning, Rosita rose early to stoke the fire and heat coffee. Caleb taught her to check the snares he'd set in the brush behind the cabin, showing her how to reset them properly. She proved a quick study, soon bringing back rabbits for the pot dot between chores. She mended Caleb's worn shirts with neat, careful stitches. Her stews grew more flavorful as she experimented with wild herbs she recognized from her mother's cooking. In the evenings, she practiced reading from his Bible while he cleaned his rifle or repaired tack. She took naturally to caring for his bay gelding, speaking to it softly in Spanish as she currycombed its coat. The horse seemed to prefer her. Gentle touch to Caleb's rougher handling, one crisp afternoon. As Rosita hung laundry on a line between pines, Caleb's head snapped up at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. He caught her eye and gestured sharply toward the cabin. She dropped the wet shirt and hurried inside without a word. Caleb retrieved his rifle from beside the door, checking that it was loaded. He stepped onto the porch, keeping his movements casual despite the tension in his shoulders. A lone rider emerged from the trees, a woman on a paint horse, wrapped in a wool blanket against the cold. He lowered his rifle slightly, recognizing Naomi Two Feathers. The Comanche trader raised a hand in greeting as she dismounted. Her dark eyes took in the fresh laundry and 2 sets of tracks in the snow before meeting his. "Brother," she said simply. "It has been many moons. Many moons." "Welcome, sister," Caleb replied, propping his rifle against the wall. "Coffee's hot if you're of a mind." She nodded, retrieving a bundle from her saddlebags. "I bring smoked venison." The hunting was good this season. Inside, Rosita had already set out 3 tin cups. She bobbed a shy curtsy as Naomi entered, earning a gentle smile from the older woman. "So, this is the one they seek," Naomi said in English, accepting a steaming cup. She switched to Spanish, addressing Rosita directly. "Be at peace, child. I am a friend." Rosita's shoulders relaxed slightly at the familiar language. She sat quietly while Caleb and Naomi spoke, her hand wrapped around her own cup. "Strangers have been asking questions in the settlements," Naomi said, her voice low. "They seek a Mexican girl who left the railroad camp with a very tall cowboy." She sipped her coffee. "They offer money for information." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Railroad men. Some. Others are doubt that harder to place. They dress like townsmen but carry guns like fighters." She glanced at Rosita. "They are determined." "Much obliged for the warning," Caleb said. "Any word on why they're so set on finding her?" Naomi shook her head. "They do not share their business. But such men do not hunt a child without dark purpose." She rose, adjusting her blanket. "I must go before darkness falls. The weather turns." At the door, she pressed the bundle of venison into Rosita's hands, speaking again in Spanish. "Be strong, little sister. The Creator sees your heart." They watched her ride away, the paint horse's hooves silent in the fresh snow. That night, after Rosita had gone to bed, Caleb sat long hours by the fire, his rifle across his knees. The wind moaned through the pines, carrying memories of Stylus' cold smile and thinly veiled threats. When he finally lay down on his bedroll, the rifle remained within easy reach beside the door-dot march brought warmer winds to the hills, melting snow in patches to reveal tender green shoots beneath. As days lengthened, Naomi's visits became more frequent, each time bringing small gifts and wisdom to share. One bright afternoon, she spread a deerskin on the cabin floor, emptying her beading pouch between them. Rosita's eyes widened at the rainbow of tiny glass beads catching the sunlight from the window. "Watch closely," Naomi said, demonstrating how to smother the smallest beads onto sinew. Her weathered fingers moved with practiced grace, creating delicate patterns of blue and white. Each bead is like a prayer. As you work, think of good things. Rosita's first attempts were clumsy, beads scattering across the floor. But Naomi's patience never wavered. "Even the smallest bird must try many times before flying," she said, helping Rosita gather the wayward beads. Outside, Caleb worked with his bay gelding, watching through the window as the 2 women bent their heads together over their craft. The sight warmed something in his chest he hadn't known was cold. When Rosita showed interest in riding, Caleb took time each morning to teach her horsemanship. He demonstrated how to check the cinch, adjust stirrups, and gentle a nervous mount. "Horses can smell fear," he explained, showing her how to approach from the shoulder. "Move slow and steady, like you got all day. That's it." He nodded approval as she stroked the bay's neck, murmuring softly in Spanish. One crisp Sunday morning, Naomi arrived earlier than usual, wearing her best trade blanket. There's a church service in Cottonwood Bend, she said. 3 hours ride. Will you come? Caleb hesitated, aware of the risk. But something in Rosita's hopeful expression made him nod. Reckon we could all use some preaching. Naomi produced a fine wool shawl from her saddlebags, draping it around Rosita's shoulders. The deep red fabric transformed the girl, making her look less like a ranch hand and more like a proper young lady. They set out as dawn painted the sky pink, frost crackling under their horses' hooves. Rosita rode between them, her borrowed shawl bright against the gray morning. The trail wound through stands of pine and across meadows, where early wildflowers dotted the melting snow. Cottonwood Bend proved to be little more than a cluster of weathered buildings around a wooden church. The simple structure wore fresh whitewash, its bell tower reaching toward heaven like a raised finger. Inside, pine benches held about 30 people, ranchers in clean shirts, women in bonnets, children fidgeting in their Sunday best. The air smelled of lamp oil and fresh-cut pine boughs. A pot-bellied stove radiated welcome warmth. Pastor Briggs, a lean man with kind eyes, nodded greeting as they took seats near the back. His sermon centered on Psalm 82, his voice rising with passion as he read, "Defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy." Caleb felt Rosita stiffen beside him at the words. He glanced down to see tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Without thinking, he reached over and squeezed her hand. She held on tight through the rest of the service. Afterward, church ladies set out biscuits and tea on rough plank tables. Townfolk gathered around, curious about the newcomers. Caleb kept his answers simple, noting how Rosita stayed close to his side, answering questions with shy nods that the tension in her shoulders eased when several children invited her to play catch with a leather ball in the churchyard. Soon her laugh joined theirs, bright and uninhibited. Watching her run in the spring sunshine, shawl flying behind her, Caleb felt his own guardedness soften. She blooms like a flower after rain, Naomi observed, joining him by the church steps. The Creator's hand is gentle with tender plants. I ain't seen her smile like that before, Caleb admitted. Makes me wonder if we should ride into town more often. Perhaps, Naomi said. But remember, flowers that bloom too boldly sometimes attract unwanted attention. The ride home seemed shorter, filled with Rosita's chatter about the children she'd met and the pastor's kind words. Golden afternoon light filtered through budding leaves as they followed the familiar trail. Back at the cabin, they shared a simple supper of venison stew and the remaining biscuits from church. Rosita hummed hymns as she stirred the pot, while Caleb and Naomi discussed spring planting plans. Peace settled over them like a warm blanket as the sun painted the western sky in streaks of pink and gold. Caleb found himself relaxing into his chair, watching contentedly as Rosita practiced. Her beadwork by Firelig cheeked out far down the valley. Beyond the circle of their awareness, two mounted figures watched from a distant ridge. But in that moment, gathered around the hearth's glow, Caleb allowed himself to believe that perhaps the danger had truly passed. Naomi told stories of her people's spring celebrations while Rosita listened intently, fingers working colored beads into careful patterns. The fire crackled softly, and for the first time since leaving the railroad camp, they felt like a real family. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Caleb saddled his bay gelding. The morning air held a hint of spring, though patches of snow still dotted the shadowed ground. He adjusted his hat, watching Naomi and Rosita gather tools to patch the cabin's leaky roof. Mind those loose shingles, he called up as Rosita carefully climbed the ladder. Don't want you slipping. We will be fine, Naomi assured him, her strong hand steadying the wooden ladder. The south fence line needs your attention more than we do. Caleb nodded, mounting up. Should be back by midday. Got beans warming on the stove if you get hungry. He rode out through the melting snow, following the familiar trail south. The morning passed quietly as he checked fence posts and mended broken wire. Around his neck, he wore the small brass cross Rosita had given him, traded for a day's worth of beadwork. Just before noon, he turned his horse toward home. The spring breeze carried a scent that made him stiffen in the saddle. Smoke. Not the sweet smell of pine burning in the hearth, but the acrid stench of destruction. He spurred his horse into a gallop, chest tightening as he crested the final ridge. Below, thick black smoke billowed from his cabin. Flames devoured the roof while Naomi and Rosita frantically passed buckets of creek water, their faces streaked with soot. "The well's run dry," Naomi shouted as he thundered into the yard. "Fire's too hot." Caleb leaped from his horse, grabbing an empty bucket. But even as he ran for the creek, he knew it was futile. The fire had too strong a hold. Heat seared his face as he watched helplessly while hungry flames consumed the home he'd built with his own hands. A terrible crack split the air. The roof beams gave way, collapsing inward in a shower of burning timber and sparks. Rosita cried out, burying her face in her hands. Naomi wrapped protective arms around the girl's shaking shoulders. When the worst of the flames died down, they surveyed the smoking ruins. The cabin's contents lay scattered in the trampled snow. Cooking pots, warped by heat, charred furniture, melted glass. Caleb's throat tightened as he spotted his scorched Bible, its pages curled and blackened. Beside it lay Rosita's half-finished quilt, the careful stitches now reduced to ash. "Over here," Naomi called, her voice tight with anger. She pointed to a crude note nailed to a charred beam. "Hand her over or hang with her. Hang with her." Caleb crumpled the paper in his fist, fury burning in his chest. Rosita stood motionless, staring at the smoking ruins of the only real home she'd known since her parents died. "We cannot stay here," Naomi said quietly. "They will return when darkness falls." Caleb nodded grimly. "Pack what you can salvage. We'll shelter at your place tonight." They gathered what little remained. Some tools, cooking implements, and spare clothes that had been in the storage shed. As they loaded the meager supplies onto their horses, Rosita touched Caleb's arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered, eyes bright with tears. "This is my fault. The railroad men, they destroyed your home because of me." Caleb knelt before her, his large hands gentle on her shoulders. "Listen close, girl. A cabin's just wood and nails. You're worth more than any building. Don't you carry this blame?" They rode the narrow trail to Naomi's cabin as sunset painted the sky crimson. Her home was smaller than Caleb's had been, a single room with a stone hearth and sleeping platforms covered in warm blankets. But it was solid, defensible, with good sight lines to the surrounding forest dot. After a simple supper of dried meat and cornbread, they gathered around the low-burning fire. Rosita sat cross-legged on a buffalo robe, fingers absently working her salvaged beads. The flames cast dancing shadows on the log walls. "I remember things," she said softly, not looking up from her beads, "about the bridge collapse. The foreman made them use rotted timber to save money. 5 men died when it fell. My papa tried to warn them." Her voice broke. Naomi moved to sit beside her, stroking her hair as she continued in a whisper. "That's why they worked me so hard in the camp after Papa died. They were afraid I would tell someone the truth." Caleb exchanged a look with Naomi over Rosita's bowed head. The pieces were falling into place now. The railroad agent's threats, the burned cabin, the warning note. "First light tomorrow, we ride for town," he said firmly. "Judge Harlan needs to hear this story. Time to end is proper and legal-like." "The judge is a fair man," Naomi agreed. "But the journey will not be safe. They will try to stop you. Let them try." Caleb's hand brushed the rifle at his side. "I aim to see justice done." The fire crackled low as night deepened around the cabin. Rosita finally slept, wrapped in one of Naomi's trade blankets. Caleb took first watch by the window, rifle across his knees. In the distance, a coyote's lonely howl echoed through the hills, and somewhere an owl called a soft warning to the darkness. Dawn crept over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Frost sparkled on the grass as Caleb led his bay gelding from Naomi's small corral. His breath formed clouds in the crisp morning air while he carefully tightened the saddle cinch. Naomi emerged from her cabin, arms laden with supplies. "Don't take my wagon," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. The journey to Fort Smith is long and the spring thaw makes for treacherous riding. Caleb nodded, knowing better than to protest. "Much obliged for your help, Naomi." Together, they loaded the wagon with essentials, blankets rolled tight against the morning damp, sacks of cornmeal and dried beans, coffee supplies, and medical herbs from Naomi's stores. Rosita helped silently, her small hands working quickly to secure the load. The wagon creaked as they set out, following the winding trail down from Naomi's hillside home. Caleb rode ahead on his gelding, scanning the muddy path for signs of trouble. Behind him, Naomi handled the wagon reins with practiced ease, while Rosita huddled beside her. Wrapped in a thick wool blanket, spring thaw had turned the trail treacherous. Mud sucked at the wagon wheels, forcing them to pick their way carefully around the worst spots. More than once, Caleb had to lead his horse back to help push when the wheels bogged down by midday. The sun had warmed the air enough to shed heavy coats. They stopped at a shallow creek to water the horses and stretch their legs. Willows lined the banks, their branches showing the first hints of green. Caleb filled their canteens, while Naomi spread a simple meal on a blanket. Jerky, hard biscuits, and dried apples. Rosita sat cross-legged on the wool blanket, her hands folded in her lap. "You've been mighty quiet today," Caleb said gently, settling beside her. "Something weighing on your mind?" Rosita nodded, her eyes fixed on the flowing creek. "I keep thinking about that day. The bridge collapse." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I see their faces in my dreams." Naomi moved closer, her presence offering silent support as Rosita continued. Papa noticed it first, the missing bolt in the main support beam. He told Mr. Jenkins, the foreman, but she swallowed hard. Jenkins said we were behind schedule. Said to keep working or we'd all lose our pay. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept silent, letting her speak. It happened so fast. The timber cracked like gunfire. 5 men were on the bridge when it fell. Tears slid down her cheeks. 3 died right there in the creek bed. The other 2 were hurt bad, broken legs, bleeding. But instead of sending for a doctor, Jenkins had his men load them in a wagon after dark. Drove them out past the camp boundary and left them there. "Sweet Jesus," Caleb muttered. "They died too, alone in the cold." Rosita's fingers twisted in her skirt. Jenkins told everyone they'd run off without paying their debts. But I saw everything from where I was washing clothes by the creek. Naomi placed a comforting hand on Rosita's shoulder. "You carry a heavy burden, little sister. But soon you will speak truth to those who can bring justice." They traveled until dusk, making slower progress than hoped due to the muddy conditions. Caleb led them to a grove of cottonwoods set back from the trail, a defensible spot with clear lines of sight and a small spring nearby. While Caleb tended the horses, Naomi and Rosita gathered fallen branches for a fire. Soon flames crackled cheerfully, pushing back the gathering darkness. They ate a simple supper of beans and coffee, speaking little dot as night settled fully around their camp. Rosita curled up in her blankets near the fire. Naomi sat beside her, humming softly, a Comanche lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. The gentle melody floated on the evening air, weaving with the pop and crackle of burning wood. Caleb positioned himself where he could watch both the trail and the surrounding shadows. His Colt revolver lay close at hand, its weight reassuring. Every snapping twig, every rustle of wind through the cottonwoods drew his attention. "You sense it too?" Naomi asked quietly, once Rosita had drifted to sleep. Caleb nodded grimly. "Been watching our back trail all day. Caught glimpses of dust now and then, always staying just out of sight." "The railroad men? Reckon so?" His hand rested on the Colt's smooth grip. "They won't let us reach Fort Smith without trying to stop us." Naomi's dark eyes reflected the firelight. "Then we must be ready when they come." They took turns standing, watched through the night, while overhead the stars wheeled slowly across the vast prairie sky. In the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that echoed off the hills. Caleb studied the deepening shadows beyond their firelight. every sense alert for danger. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, they had shelter, warmth, and each other. But Caleb knew their pursuers were out there in the darkness, waiting. The time for confrontation drew near. Dawn broke cold and gray over the rolling prairie. Caleb studied the muddy trail ahead, while Naomi hitched the horses to her wagon. Rosita helped pack away their bedrolls, her movements quick and nervous in. Be early light? Best get moving, Caleb said, swinging into his saddle. Got a lot of ground to cover before nightfall. They set out as the sun cleared the horizon, Caleb riding point while Naomi handled the wagon reins. The morning air held a bite, and their breath steamed in pale clouds. Wagon wheels creaked through mud and patches of lingering snowdot near mid-morning. As the trail wound between two rocky rises, Caleb raised his hand in warning. Ahead, two riders sat their horses across the path, a burly man with a scarred cheek that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer, and a thin fellow whose hat brim drooped low over his eyes. That's far enough, the scarred man called out. His voice was rough as wagon wheels on gravel. Caleb reined his horse to a stop, keeping one hand near his rifle. Behind him, he heard Naomi slow the wagon. The thin man touched his hat brim. We're deputies from the territorial court. Come to collect the Mexican girl. That's so. Caleb's tone was mild, but his eyes were hard. Reckon I'd like to see your papers. The scarred man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. Funny thing about them papers. They got burned up in our cook stove last night. His hand rested too close to his holster. But you're gonna hand her over all the same. Both men dismounted, boots squelching in the mud. The thin one kept his drooping hat tilted forward, hiding his eyes, while his companion's scarred face twisted into an ugly grin. Last warning, Caleb said quietly. Mount up and ride away. The scarred man's hand twitched toward his gun. Or, what, cowboy? You gonna take us both? Tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Then Naomi's voice rang out sharp and clear, but not in English. The strange syllables of Comanche rolled across the morning air, making both men turn their heads in startled confusion. That moment was all Caleb needed. His rifle came up smooth as silk, the action cycling with a metallic click that echoed off the rocks. Now then, he said softly, why don't you boys reconsider? The thin man's shoulders sagged. His partner's face darkened with rage, but he wasn't fool enough to test Caleb's aim. This ain't over, the scarred man snarled as they backed toward their horses. We'll be waiting, sleep sometime. Maybe so, Caleb agreed. But you won't like what happens if you try anything before we reach Fort Smith. They mounted awkwardly, dignity forgotten in their haste to retreat. The scarred man spat one final time before they wheeled their horses and galloped back the way. They'd come. Once they were out of sight, Caleb turned to Naomi. Much obliged for the distraction. What did you say to them? A hint of a smile touched her lips. I told them the spirits of my ancestors would curse their manhood if they shed blood on this trail. She clicked to the horses, starting the wagon. Forward again. Some men fear such things more than bullets. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. We'd best take a long way around now. Through the foothills. The new route added miles to their journey, following winding deer trails and shallow creek beds. By late afternoon, clouds had rolled in, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. They made camp in a sheltered draw, the wagon's canvas cover providing extra protection from the weather. After a cold supper of jerky and hardtack, Rosita huddled beneath her blankets in the wagon bed. Wind rattled the canvas, its mournful whistle mixing with the creak of wagon boards. Sleep was long in coming, got in. Her dreams, she stood once again beside that fatal bridge. The day was bright and cold, the air full of hammering and men's shouts. She saw her father point to the missing bolt, saw the foreman's angry dismissal. Then came the terrible cracking sound, the screams, the splash of bodies hitting the creek far below. She tried to run forward to warn them, but her feet wouldn't move. She woke with a gasp, heart pounding. The wind still moaned outside, but a quiet voice murmured nearby. Caleb's voice, low and earnest in prayer. Lord, I ain't always been the best at following your path, he whispered. But this girl needs protection, needs justice done. Show me how to keep her safe, how to see this through. Amen. Rosita lay still, touched by his words. Eventually, the rhythm of the wind and the steady breathing of her companions lulled her back to sleep. But Caleb remained awake, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond and praying for guidance through whatever tomorrow might bring. The night stretched long, broken only by the wind's keening and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. Stars peeked through breaks in the clouds, their cold light offering little comfort as Caleb maintained his vigil, knowing their enemies were out there, waiting for another chance to strike. The mountain trail wound higher into rough country, forcing them to pick their way carefully between jutting rocks and stubborn scrub oak. By late afternoon, the horses' flanks were dark with sweat, and everyone felt the strain of constant vigilance. "There's a spring ahead," Naomi said, pointing to a cluster of cottonwoods nestled in a natural bowl of red stone. "Good water there, and the approach is easy to watch." Caleb nodded, studying the surrounding ridgelines through narrowed eyes. "Reckon that's as good a spot as any to rest the horses." They made camp near the spring, where mineral-rich water bubbled up clear and sweet between moss-covered rocks. Naomi tended to the horses while Caleb gathered wood for a small fire. Rosita helped arrange their bedrolls beneath a broad cottonwood. The sun had just touched the western peaks when a lone figure appeared on the trail, a Ute hunter with a string of fresh-caught trout. Naomi stepped forward, greeting him in his own language. After a brief exchange, she traded him a handful of coffee beans and some tobacco for 3 plump fish. "A blessing," she said, returning to the fire where Caleb was setting up a cooking tripod. "Fresh food will do us all good." The fish sizzled in Caleb's old skillet, filling the air with a mouth-watering aroma. As they ate, Caleb leaned back against his saddle and cleared his throat. "Reminds me of the time I had to break that ornery mule of old Jake Peterson's," he began, a rare smile touching his eyes. That creature had a mind harder than mountain granite. Rosita looked up from her plate, interested. Even Naomi paused in her eating to listen. "This meal, he'd let you saddle him right proper," Caleb continued, "but the moment you put a foot in the stirrup, he'd start spinning like a top. Threw every hand on the ranch, including Jake's own boys." He chuckled, remembering. "So I figured maybe this mule just needs to learn spinning ain't so much fun." Rosita leaned forward, fish forgotten. "What did you do?" "Well, next time he started spinning instead of fighting it, I just went with him. Round and round we went, me encouraging him the whole time." "That's right, buddy, you just keep on turning." Caleb's voice took on a sing-song quality. "We can do this all day if you want." A giggle escaped Rosita's lips. The first real laugh they'd heard from her in days. The sound was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "That mule kept spinning for nearly an hour," Caleb said, grinning now. "Finally got so dizzy he could barely stand up straight. After that, he was the most well-behaved. The sharp crack of a rifle split the evening air, echoing off the canyon walls. Everyone froze. A second shot kicked up dirt near the spring. "Into the rocks," Caleb commanded, already moving. They scrambled for cover behind a cluster of boulders as another shot rang out. "Stay here," Caleb told them, rifle in hand. "I'm going to circle around, see what we're dealing with." He moved like a shadow through the gathering dusk, using the terrain for cover. The shooting had stopped, but that worried him more than reassured him. 20 minutes of careful scouting revealed fresh boot prints in a sandy wash. At least 3 men had passed through recently, heading toward higher ground. When he returned to their camp, Naomi had already doused the fire and was quietly repacking the wagon. Rosita helped her, moving with the careful precision of someone trying very hard to be brave. "We need to move," Caleb said softly. "They're trying to get above us for a better shooting position. But I reckon they won't expect us to travel by night." Naomi nodded grimly. "The moon will be full enough." They broke camp under the rising moon, working quickly and quietly. Caleb wrapped the wagon wheels in burlap to muffle their sound, while Naomi tied bits of cloth around the horses' hooves to soften their steps. The night was clear and cold. Stars scattered like diamond dust across the sky. They moved slowly, Caleb leading on foot to guide them past the worst obstacles. The wrapped wheels crunched softly on gravel and stone, each sound seeming too loud in the stillness. Rosita fought to stay awake on the wagon seat beside Naomi, wrapped in a thick blanket against the mountain chill. The gentle swaying of the wagon and the rhythmic creak of leather made her eyelids heavy. Every so often, she would jerk awake, heart pounding, certain she'd heard pursuit. But there was only the whisper of the wind and the soft flutter of owl wings. They traveled through the darkest hours, using the moon's light to pick their way down from the high country. As false dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pearl and rose, Caleb called a halt at the crest of a long slope. Below them, maybe 5 miles distant, lights twinkled in the pre-dawn gloom, the county seat of Fort Smith, somewhere. In that collection of buildings was the courthouse, and with it, the hope of justice. Rosita stared at those distant lights, hardly daring to believe they'd made it this far. Beside her, Naomi squeezed her hand gently. Caleb stood at the horses' heads, his tall figure outlined against the lightening sky, watching for any sign they'd been followed. The last stars faded as morning crept closer, and with them the long night's dangers began to recede. But none of them relaxed their vigilance. They still had miles to go, and the railroad's men wouldn't give up easily. The final leg of their journey might prove the most dangerous of all. The morning sun climbed higher as they approached Fort Smith, their horses' hooves clicking against the packed dirt of the main street. Shop signs creaked in the spring breeze, and the bustle of townspeople going about their morning business filled the air. After the tense quiet of their night journey, the ordinary sounds of civilization felt almost jarring. Caleb guided them toward Miller's livery, a weathered 2-story building with fresh-painted trim. The owner, a stout man with gray-streaked whiskers, emerged from the shadowy interior, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. "Need boarding for 2 horses and a wagon," Caleb said, dismounting stiffly. The long night ride had left them all saddle-weary. "In the room, if you've got one available upstairs." Miller nodded, eyeing their trail-worn appearance. "Got a small room above the stable. Clean enough, though you might hear the horses below." "That'll do fine," Caleb said. Helping Rosita down from the wagon, she stumbled slightly, exhausted from the journey. Naomi steadied her with a gentle hand, while Miller led their horses into the stable. Caleb counted out coins from his dwindling funds. The room would stretch their resources thin, but he wouldn't leave Rosita and Naomi without shelter. "You 2 get settled," he told them, once Miller had shown them to the simple room above the stable. It was spare but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a wash basin by the window. "I need to see Judge Harlan straight away." The courthouse stood at the end of the main street, its red brick walls and white columns an imposing sight after days in the wilderness. Caleb climbed the worn steps, his boots echoing in the high-ceilinged corridor as he sought the judge's chambers. Judge Horace Harlan proved to be a tall, thin man with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. He sat ramrod straight behind his desk, regarding Caleb with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Your Honor," Caleb began, removing his hat, "I've brought evidence of criminal negligence by the railroad at Dead Man's Cut, a witness to the bridge. Collapse that killed 5 men." Harlan's expression remained neutral. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Ransom." "Caleb Ransom. And this witness, a girl named Rosita Alvarez. She worked in the camp, saw everything. How they used faulty materials, ignored the warnings. How they disposed of the bodies after." The judge steepled his fingers. "You understand, Mr. Ransom, that without substantial evidence, the railroad claim this is mere slander. There. Lawyers are ... particularly aggressive in such matters." "She deserves to be heard, Your Honor," Caleb insisted, leaning forward. "Those men deserve justice." Harlan studied him for a long moment. "I cannot guarantee the outcome, but I will hear the girl's testimony tomorrow morning." He reached for his calendar. 10 o'clock sharp. "Thank you, Your Honor." Feeling cautiously hopeful, Caleb left the courthouse. He found Naomi and Rosita waiting outside the general store, where they had gone to purchase supplies. Rosita looked better after washing up and changing into a clean dress from their salvaged belongings. The judge will hear your story tomorrow. Morning, he told them, but before he could explain more, a cold voice cut through the air. Caleb Ransom? They turned to see a lean man in a black vest, silver star pinned to his chest, approaching with purposeful strides. Sheriff Madson's face was as hard as winter frost, his eyes cold and calculating. That's right, Caleb answered evenly, though his spine stiffened at the lawman's tone. You're under arrest for the kidnapping of a minor. Madsen drew a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. Turn around slowly. Rosita gasped, clutching at Naomi's arm. No, he didn't kidnap me. He saved me. Step back, girl, Madsen ordered sharply. A small crowd began to gather, watching the scene unfold. Caleb raised his hands, keeping his voice calm. There's been a mistake, Sheriff. I have papers. Save it for the judge. Madsen grabbed Caleb's wrist, snapping the first cuff into place. You can explain why you took a Mexican child across county lines without proper authority? Rosita tried to rush forward, but Naomi held her back, understanding the danger of the situation. Caleb met their eyes as Madsen secured the second cuff. It's all right, he assured them, even as the sheriff roughly turned him toward the jail. I'll be fine. Stay with Naomi. Rosita, don't worry about me. But tears streamed down Rosita's face as she watched Madsen march Caleb away. Naomi pulled her close, speaking softly in her ear. Be strong, little one. This is not over yet. The growing crowd parted as Sheriff Madsen led Caleb down the street toward the jailhouse. Caleb walked with his head high, refusing to show fear or shame. He had done nothing wrong, and he would not let them make him appear guilty. The last thing he saw before being pushed through the jail door was Rosita's tear-stained face as Naomi guided her back toward the livery. He sent up a silent prayer. For their safety, knowing the railroad's men would be watching, waiting for any opportunity to silence the truth Rosita carried. The cell door clanged shut behind him with terrible finality. Sheriff Madsen's boots clicked across the wooden floor as he returned to his desk, leaving Caleb alone with his worries in the gathering shadows of the jail. The iron bars cast long shadows across the jail cell floor as evening approached. Caleb sat on the thin bunk, his broad shoulders hunched against the chill stone wall. The cell smelled of dust and old straw, with only a small window high up letting in the fading light. A rasping cough drew his attention to the adjacent cell. An elderly man with a tangled white beard and threadbare coat huddled on his own bunk, regarding Caleb with sharp blue eyes. Name's Hank, the old man offered, his voice rough but friendly. Caught me sleeping in Murphy's abandoned barn. Sheriff says that's vagrancy. He spat into a corner. Reckon the real crime was not having enough coin to pay him off. Caleb nodded in greeting. Caleb Ransom. Heard them bring you in. Hank shifted closer to the bars, separating their cells. That business about kidnapping. It don't sound right. To me, seeing you ride in with that Indian woman and the young girl didn't look like no kidnapping I ever saw. It wasn't, Caleb said firmly. I bought her freedom from the railroad camp. Legal and proper. Hank's expression darkened. Railroad, eh? That explains plenty. He glanced toward the front office where Sheriff Madsen's shadow moved across frosted glass. In a lower voice, he continued, Been here 3 days? Night before. Last couple of railroad men came in real late. Couldn't hear everything, but there was talk of money changing hands. Sheriff seemed mighty interested in whatever they were selling. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach knot with worry for Rosita. Across town, in a modest white clapboard house beside the church, Naomi Two Feathers watched Rosita pick listlessly at a bowl of beef stew. Pastor Briggs's wife had laid out a fine supper, but the girl seemed unable to eat. You must keep up your strength, Naomi said softly in Spanish. Caleb would want you to eat. Rosita's lower lip trembled. It's my fault. He's in jail. If I hadn't told him about the bridge, no, Naomi cut in firmly. The fault lies with those who caused those deaths, not with you for speaking truth. Pastor Briggs set down his spoon, his kind face creased with concern. I'll speak to Judge Harlan first thing tomorrow. He's a fair man despite the pressure he's under. He exchanged a meaningful look with his wife. But I should warn you, these railroad cases move quickly. They'll want it settled before word spreads. How quickly? Naomi asked, though she dreaded the answer. The trial could be as soon as the day after tomorrow. The pastor dabbed his mouth with a napkin. They'll try to discredit the girl's testimony. Make it seem like imagination or confusion. Rosita pushed her bowl away, her face pale. I know what I saw. Those men died because the railroad wanted to save money on proper bolts. I heard the foreman say so himself. Mrs. Briggs reached across the table to pat her hand. We believe you, dear. And God knows the truth. As night settled over the town, Rosita sat in a rocking chair by the kitchen fire, wrapped in a quilt Mrs. Briggs had provided. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as she watched the embers glow. Her lips moved silently, forming the words Caleb had helped her learn from his Bible. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, ... In his cold cell, Caleb knelt beside his bunk, hands clasped as he prayed the same words. The moonlight streaming through his window painted a silver cross on the stone floor. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done ... Their separate voices, though unheard by human ears, rose together in the night. Rosita's soft whispers mingled with the crackling fire, while Caleb's deep murmur echoed faintly off his cell walls. Though divided by iron bars and town blocks, their shared faith bridged the distance between them. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses. Hank watched silently from his cell, his weathered face softening at the sight of the big cowboy on his knees. He removed his battered hat, holding it respectfully over his heart. As we forgive those who trespass against us ... In the pastor's kitchen, Naomi sat nearby, weaving a small medicine pouch as she kept vigil. Her own prayers, learned in the mission school so many years ago, joined with Rosita's in the firelit quiet. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil ... The town clock struck 9, its deep tones rolling across the darkened streets. In the jail, Caleb rose from his prayers, his faith lending him strength for whatever tomorrow might bring. In the pastor's house, Rosita finally dozed in the rocking chair, the completed prayer still on her lips. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory, forever. Amen. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long rectangles across the worn wooden floor. The small courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as townspeople filed in, filling the hard benches. Judge Harlan's desk stood elevated at the front, its dark wood gleaming beneath the American flag. Caleb sat at the defense table, his wrists finally free of handcuffs. Despite 3 days in jail, he held himself straight, his clean-shaven face betraying no fear. Pastor Briggs had brought him a fresh shirt and helped him look presentable for court. Still, his large frame seemed confined by the small chair, like a bear made to sit at a tea party. At the prosecution table, a sleek-looking railroad lawyer in an expensive suit arranged papers with precise movements. Sheriff Madsen lounged against the wall near the door, his badge catching the light as he watched the proceedings with calculated disinterest. Judge Harlan entered, his black robe sweeping behind him. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The shuffle of boots and rustle of skirts filled the room as everyone stood. The judge settled into his chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying authority. Without raising its volume, "We're here to address the matter of the territory versus Caleb Ransom on charges of kidnapping a minor." He peered down at the documents before him. "Mr. Peterson, you may present the territory's case." The railroad lawyer rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we will prove that the defendant, a rootless drifter with no fixed address, took 15-year-old Rosita Alvarez from her legal workplace without proper authority." His polished voice dripped with manufactured concern. "This man has no family, no standing in the community, and no right to remove a child from her rightful situation." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he remained still. In the gallery, Naomi Two Feathers sat straight back beside Mrs. Briggs, her dark eyes never leaving the proceedings. Rosita perched between them, wearing a borrowed dress, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The prosecutor called character. Witnesses, railroad men who described Caleb as threatening and intimidating. Each testimony felt rehearsed, designed to paint him as a dangerous drifter. Pastor Briggs, serving as Caleb's counsel, cross-examined them with careful questions. That revealed their connection to the railroad. Finally, the moment came for Rosita to testify. She walked to the witness stand, her step small but determined. After being sworn in, she sat with her shoulders pressed against the wooden chair back, looking even younger in the large courtroom. Miss Alvarez, Pastor Briggs began gently, please. Tell the court how you came to be at Dead Man's Cut Railroad Camp. Rosita's voice started soft but grew stronger as she spoke. My father worked there laying track. When he died in an accident, the foreman said I had to work in the kitchen to pay his debt. Her fingers twisted in her skirt. They made me sleep in the storage shed. The cook. She swallowed hard. He was not kind. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harlan leaned forward slightly, his expression grave. And how did you meet the defendant? Senator Caleb saw me carrying heavy pots with burned hands. He Her voice caught with emotion. He paid his own wages to free me, $18. She looked directly at Caleb for the first time. No one had ever shown me such kindness. The prosecutor stood to object, but before he could speak, the courthouse doors crashed open. Every head turned as two men entered, their clothes worn but clean, their bearing dignified despite their obvious poverty. Caleb recognized them as railroad workers from the camp. Your Honor, the first man called out in accented English. Stepping forward, we must speak. Judge Harlan rapped his gavel once. This is highly irregular. Who are you? I am Miguel Vasquez, and this is Carlos Rodriguez. We worked at Dead Man's Cut when the bridge collapsed. He held up a leather-bound book and a stack of papers. We have proof of the railroad's crimes. The prosecutor's face reddened. Your Honor, this is outrageous. These men have no standing. Let them speak, Judge Harlan commanded. Silencing the objection, Miguel approached the bench, Carlos beside him. This ledger shows false materials, ordered for the bridge. And these pay receipts, they prove they charged us for food and tools at 4 times the store prices. They trapped us there, working for nothing. And how did you obtain these documents? The judge asked. Carlos spoke. When the accident happened, they tried to burn everything. But Sonara too, Feathers. Double quotes, he nodded toward Naomi. She helped us hide these in her trading wagon. She knew someday they would be needed for justice. The railroad lawyer sputtered. These documents were stolen. They're inadmissible, and they were rescued from destruction, Judge Harlan corrected, sharply. He accepted the ledger, studying its pages with deepening concern. The payment receipts passed from hand to hand among the jury, causing looks of disgust at the inflated prices. Rosita remained in the witness stand, her eyes bright with unshed tears as Miguel described the bridge collapse she had witnessed. 5 men died that day, he said solemnly. Good men with families. The foreman ordered their bodies taken away before the territory inspector could arrive. Sheriff Madsen had straightened from his lounging position, no longer looking so certain of the outcome. The railroad lawyer shuffled his papers nervously, his earlier smoothness cracking. Judge Harlan spent long minutes examining the evidence. The courtroom silent except for the soft creak of wooden benches as people leaned forward in anticipation. His weathered face was unreadable as he compared documents, occasionally adjusting his spectacles to study a detail more closely. The morning light had shifted, dust motes dancing in the slanting beams as the judge finally set down the last paper. He looked out over the crowded courtroom, his gaze moving from the immigrant workers to Rosita to Caleb, and finally settling on the railroad's representative with steel in his eyes. The evidence before me shows not one crime, but many. He declared, his voice heavy with authority. Not by the defendant, but by those who would use this court to continue their abuse of power. Dot. Judge Harlan's stern gaze swept across the courtroom as he delivered his verdict, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. Having reviewed the evidence presented, this court finds Caleb Ransom not only innocent of kidnapping, but worthy of commendation for his moral courage. The judge's words rang clear as bells in the hushed chamber. He acted to protect a child from exploitation, which is not a crime, but a duty that any God-fearing man should uphold. Caleb remained, still in his chair, but his shoulders relaxed slightly for the first time since the trial began. Rosita pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks as Mrs. Briggs hugged her close. Judge Harlan wasn't finished. He lifted the ledger from his desk, holding it like evidence of a grave sin. Furthermore, based on these documents and testimony presented, I hereby issue a warrant for the immediate arrest of Samuel Whitaker, foreman of Dead Man's Cut Camp, on charges of criminal negligence resulting in death, fraud, and multiple violations of territorial labor laws. Sheriff Madsen straightened from his wall, his face uncertain as he glanced between the judge and the railroad lawyer. Sheriff, Judge Harlan's voice cracked like a whip. You will execute this warrant without delay. And I expect a full investigation into any of your deputies who may have aided in this corruption. The sheriff's face reddened, but he nodded stiffly. Additionally, the judge continued, I order all unpaid wages, with interest, to be distributed to the families of the deceased, workers and all current laborers at Dead Man's Cut. He fixed the railroad lawyer with a steel-edged stare. The territory will oversee this distribution to ensure compliance. The lawyer opened his mouth to object, but Judge Harlan silenced him with a raised hand. Any appeal can be filed with the territorial court in Denver. I'm certain they'll be most interested in reviewing these documents. Turning his attention to where Rosita sat between Mrs. Briggs and Naomi, the judge's expression softened. As to the matter of Miss Alvarez's guardianship, I have reviewed Pastor Briggs's recommendation and Miss Two Feathers' character testimony. He smiled slightly. It is the finding of this court that Caleb Ransom has demonstrated both the moral fiber and practical means to serve as our legal guardian. The territory hereby grants him full guardianship rights and responsibilities. Joy erupted in the courtroom. The immigrant workers embraced each other, their faces shining with vindication. Pastor Briggs clapped Caleb on the shoulder as townspeople jumped to their feet, their cheers drowning out the sharp rap of the judge's gavel. Court is adjourned, Judge Harlan declared. Though few could hear him over the celebration, people streamed out into the spring sunshine, the mood more festive than formal. On the courthouse steps, a crowd gathered around Caleb. Merchants, ranchers, and townspeople who had watched the trial stepped forward to shake his hand, many offering help to rebuild his burned cabin. Much obliged, Caleb said again and again, ducking his head slightly at the praise. His eyes sought out Rosita, who stood with Naomi at the edge of the crowd, looking almost dazed by the turn of events. The crowd parted as Caleb moved toward them. He knelt in front of Rosita, his massive frame bringing him down to her eye level. His voice was gentle but firm as he spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. You've got a home now, girl, he said simply. A real one, proper, and legal. Rosita's eyes filled with fresh tears, but her smile was radiant. Thank you, Senator Caleb. She whispered. Naomi stepped forward, her dark eyes warm with emotion. She took Rosita's small hand and placed it in Caleb's large one, then covered them both with her own weathered fingers. The gesture carried the weight of ceremony, bridging cultures and hearts in the space of a breath. The Creator brings good from evil, she said, softly in her accented English. A new family rises from ashes. More townspeople approached to offer congratulations. Mrs. Peterson from the Mercantile promised to help Rosita select fabric for new curtains. The blacksmith's wife whispered that she had a spare cooking pot she'd bring by. Even the banker stepped forward to discuss terms for a cabin building loan, though Caleb suspected he wouldn't need it, given the offers of help already pouring in as the sun began to set. Pastor Briggs guided them all to his home, where his wife had prepared a celebration. Supper. The modest parlor filled with the aroma of fresh bread and beef stew. Rosita sat between Caleb and Naomi at the table, her face glowing in the lamplight as she finally allowed herself to believe in her good fortune. Over coffee and Mrs. Briggs's apple pie, they began making plans. The pastor had paper and pencil, ready as they sketched out ideas for the new cabin. It would be larger than the old line shack, with a proper bedroom for Rosita and a bigger kitchen window to let in the morning light. "We can start clearing the burned timber next week," offered Tom Wheeler, the sawmill owner who had stayed to help plan. "I've got fresh log seasoning that'll be perfect for the walls." Naomi added her practical wisdom to the planning. "Build the roof steep," she advised. "Winter snows are heavy in that valley." Rosita listened to it all, her eyes growing heavy despite her excitement. When she finally dozed off in a rocking chair, Caleb draped his coat over her like a blanket. The sight of the massive garment nearly swallowing her small frame made the women smile. "She's got a long healing ahead," Naomi observed quietly. "But she's strong. That one, like new grass after prairie fire." Caleb nodded, watching his new daughter sleep. "Reckon we all do some healing together," he said. "Ain't that what family's for?" The pastor's wife brought out more coffee as they continued planning into the night. Tomorrow would bring hard work and new challenges, but tonight was for gratitude and hope. Through the parsonage windows, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Witnesses to the birth of a new family forged in faith, justice, and love. Spring burst into the high country like a painter's brush, dabbing wildflowers across meadows, and coating the aspens in tender green. The valley echoed with the rhythmic thud of axes and hammers as neighbors gathered to help rebuild. Caleb and Rosita's home. Tom Wheeler's seasoned logs went up strong and true, each one carefully notched by skilled hands. The new cabin rose larger than before, with thick walls to ward off winter's chill and windows placed to catch the morning light. Men from 3 counties pitched in, working from sunrise to sunset, sharing stories and breaking bread together. At noon, "Reckon this roof'll stand against anything," declared Jim Peterson as they laid the final beam. The steep pitch Naomi suggested would indeed shed the heaviest snows, and the fresh-cut shingles gleamed like silver in the spring sunshine. The women of Cottonwood Bend weren't idle, either. They arrived in wagons laden with household necessities, pans, linens, and preserves. Mrs. Peterson helped Rosita select cheerful yellow fabric for curtains, while the minister's wife brought a box of books for the new shelves Caleb built. Along one wall, when Naomi arrived with her gift of bead-trimmed curtains, Rosita's eyes filled with tears. The delicate Comanche beadwork caught the light like dewdrops, creating patterns that seemed to dance in the breeze. "They tell a story of new beginnings," Naomi explained, helping Rosita hang them carefully around the kitchen window. The first Sunday in their new home dawned clear and bright. Neighbors began arriving after church, carrying covered dishes and warm wishes. The cabin filled with the aroma of fresh bread, roasted venison, and Mrs. Wheeler's famous apple pies. Children played in the yard while their elders gathered around the new pine table, bigger than the old one to accommodate friends and family. Laughter rang through the rooms, warming them like sunshine. Even Pastor Briggs joined in when Tom Wheeler told the story of how his mule had stolen their lunch during the roof raising. Rosita moved among the guests with growing confidence, her shy smile brightening as she served coffee in the new cups Mrs. Peterson had given them. That evening, as the guests departed and peace settled over the valley, Rosita carefully spread her finished quilt across her bed. Each patch told a story scraps from Mrs. Briggs's sewing basket. A piece of Naomi's old shawl, even a square from one of Caleb's worn shirts. She smoothed it with gentle hands, this tangible piece of belonging. Caleb stepped out onto the wide porch as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. The spring air carried the scent of pine and new grass, and somewhere far down the valley, a train whistle echoed like a distant memory. He could hear Rosita's clear voice through the open window, reading from their new Bible, while Naomi's soft humming provided a gentle accompaniment. The giant cowboy stood quietly, watching. Darkness gathered in the valley that had become their sanctuary. In town, people still talked about how he'd laid down his wages to buy a girl's freedom. But standing there, listening to the quiet voices of his newfound family, Caleb knew the truth in saving Rosita. He'd found something worth far more than money could ever buy. Dive. Today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love. I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here, where love speaks softly and stays.